Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline and this is Made with Books, and today I am doing the second video in my series of dementia and literature. If you missed the first video, I will link it down below. Today we're focusing on one book in particular, and that book is Still Alice by Genova. Now, before I go into this book, in no way is it a perfect novel. It is perfect to me, however, I dearly love it. I read it for the third time in preparation of this video, and I have no idea why I didn't put it on my top 10 booktube tag. And I also said in my mid-year freakout tag that I haven't cried with any books yet so far in this year, and this book has definitely changed that. I cried several times while reading this. It's just a story that is close to my heart. But before I get into the novel itself, I wanted to talk a little bit more about something that I mentioned in my first video, and that was the way that we define identity. And this is really important when we talk about dementia, and it is an aspect that Genova very much picks up on in Still Alice, and we will get to that eventually. And if you think about it, the way we usually define identity is through narrative. So the idea that we tell stories and that is what distinguishes us from any other animal on the planet, and that is what makes us specifically human, and that has potential in a way, but it also runs the risk of excluding people. Because the thing with dementia is that those skills that are needed to tell stories, they are gradually lost. So does that mean those people that forget their past and are no longer able to relate their lives to stories about themselves, does that mean they no longer have an identity? Because if you think about it that way, it becomes a very troublesome concept. There are alternative ways of thinking about identity, and one way that I would want to point out is thinking about identity in the way that is relational. In our lives, we are also very much defined by the relationships we have, whether you think about relationships in terms of friends and family members, or even just the people that you meet in your day-to-day life, the people that sell you groceries at the store, or the doctor that treats you. Those are also interactions and relationships that you have. This, in a way, is something that defines everybody's life as well, and you could argue that identity can be defined as relational then. And if you are basing it upon this definition, and I'm quoting now from an article called Seeing Whole, then people with dementia have to be understood in terms of relationships, not because that is all that is left to them, but because this is characteristic of all of our lives. Seeing beyond what we usually identify as identity might be helpful when we think about dementia, to not run the risk of exclude people from personhood. And obviously this argument not only qualifies for people with dementia, but also people with other neurological illnesses. So getting back to Still Alice. Now, as the title already gives away, our main protagonist is Alice Howland. And Alice Howland in this story is, as at the beginning, 50 years old, and she is a successful professor at Harvard University of no other subject than psycholinguistics of all things. She gets diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease, and of course this diagnosis derails Alice's life and those lives of those around her. So of her husband John, who also is a professor at Harvard, of her children Anna, Tom and Lydia, not only because their mother is suffering from the disease, but also because there's a strong genetic linkage with regards to early onset Alzheimer's disease, so the risk that they themselves will have it. The novel is told fairly straightforward, so it's told chronological, so as you read the novel, Alice's symptoms worsen throughout, and it is told about throughout the span of 2 years. You get the first things that Alice starts noticing that something might not be right. What is special about this novel is that it is told through Alice's perspective, and because of that, you find yourself in the mind of somebody with Alzheimer's disease, but at the same time you sometimes have more knowledge than Alice, even though you're seeing things through her perspective, but you're realizing that the mistakes that she's making, whereas she is not. As you can imagine, with Alice being a professor for psycholinguistics, this diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, and while it would be a terrible diagnosis for anybody, with Alice's field of work, it obviously is particularly poignant that she contracts this disease, because at the heart of her work lie the mind and language, two things she's about to lose. And in this context, it is noteworthy that the first word that Alice loses early on as she gives the talk, and she later recovers the word, so you find out which word it is, but the word that she is looking for and that she cannot find is lexicon. So in that sense, sometimes the novel hits you a bit over the head with it, if you know what I mean, but it's still a very powerful story. Now, like I said, Alice is the one whose perspectives you're getting, and even before she has her diagnosis and she realizes she's making mistakes, but she's not realizing all the mistakes that she's making. So one scene that very much shows this is she's at a work party and she meets Dan, whose thesis she supervises. She meets him together with her husband, and Dan has recently gotten married, and so she meets his wife there for the first time and is introduced to her. And she then goes to the bathroom, comes back, and tells you that she's seeing John and Dan in conversation with a young, pretty woman in a red dress. And so obviously she has forgotten the previous conversation. And she goes back in, talks to them and asks who this woman is. And obviously everybody reacts sort of irritated, but they don't really tell her that she's already asked this question. So it's kind of an awkward situation. And throughout the story you can also see how people react to it. When she tells people at work, the people that she considers to be her family also, some of them react very poorly and they don't interact with her more than they need to. So it also shows the stigmatization of people with dementia and what that does to them. There are other situations where Alice doesn't realize that she's making mistakes. So one instance is where she makes a crucial mistake is she's still teaching her class, and she goes into that class, and instead of going up front to teach her class, she sits down and waits for the teacher to come in. So there's a time shift for her. So she thinks she's a student again and doesn't realize that in the present time she no longer is a student but a professor herself. And eventually she just gets up and tells people, you know, I don't know about you guys, but I have better things to do than to sit around and wait here, and leaves. But she doesn't realize this until eventually student evaluations come in and she realizes she has let more things slip than she's been aware of. And these things in a way isolate her. They show her failing to act according to social conventions, and they don't only reveal Alice's memory loss, but also her increasing failure to notice that loss herself. Another thing the novel shows is the way that her spatial perception skills are altered by the disease. And something that happens very early on in the novel is that she goes running, and she loves to go running. And all of a sudden she's on this route that she's been running on all her life, and she doesn't know any longer where she is. She recognizes all the familiar spots around her, but she can't put them in a map and find her way back home, which is obviously terrifying for her. And this is the time that she first realizes something must probably be really wrong. In a way, it doesn't only show how her spatial concept is changed through the disease. You can also read it as a metaphor in a way, because while she still has all the individual pieces on the map, she can no longer connect them. In the same way, her brain, the neurons are still there, but the synapses are no longer working between the neurons and connecting them. And it sort of is a metaphor for that, if you will. Also, you can see in terms of space how the disease confines her space. So in the beginning, the facts talked about that because of her job, she gives talks and conferences, goes to conferences worldwide. She flies everywhere and goes to all these universities. Once she has the diagnosis, she decides to no longer do any of those trips because it's become too risky for her. The further the story progresses, the more her space is confined. She eventually has to stop working at the uni, so that is no longer a place where she goes. The novel also shows how the disease makes Alice struggle with her visual and spatial perception. And one way it does that is when she wants to go out for a run and she wants to go to the door, and this is what happens. She raced to the front hallway but then stopped before she could reach the door. It was the strangest thing. There was a large hole in the floor just in front of the door. It spanned the width of the hallway and was about 8 or 9 feet in length, with nothing but the dark basement below it. It was impassable. The front hall floorboards were warped and creaky, and she and John had talked recently about replacing them. Had John hired a contractor? Had someone been there today? She couldn't remember. Whatever the reason, there was no using the front door until the hole was fixed. Now you're thinking that is kind of weird as you're reading it, but because you get it through her perspective, you're not quite sure what is going on. But then later on, the mail is being dropped and she cannot get at the mail supposedly because there's this hole. The mail had just been delivered through the slot in the door and it lay on top of the hole, somehow hovering there. It had to be balancing on an underlying beam or floorboard that she couldn't see. Floating mail, my brain is fried. She retreated into the study and tried to forget about the gravity-defying hole in the front hallway. It was surprisingly difficult. Now eventually her daughter comes home, her oldest, Anna, and stands on the hole. And you know it can't be a hole, but because you're seeing it from Alice's perspective, you get the same confusion that she does, although you might infer earlier than she realizes that in fact it's not a hole, it's a carpet, and she can no longer her brain can no longer properly recognize it. You really get a look into inside the mind of somebody with Alzheimer's disease in this novel, because it is told from her perspective. I think this is a very significant strength of the novel. I already talked a little bit about time and the way that Alice is not always in her perception of time correct, and the way when she was in her lecture, for example, thinking she was a student, it transported her back to an earlier time. So the real time and her mind time don't always coincide. And another instance is when she talks to her youngest daughter, Lydia, and asks her where Anne is. And Lydia tells her, you know, Anna and Charlie are coming later. And then Alice says, I'm not talking about Anna, I'm talking about Anne. And Lydia realizes that Alice is talking about her dead sister. And she tells her, you know, your sister died in a car crash. And Alice cannot understand that this has been a long, long time ago and that she actually has processed this grief in the past. But it feels to her so immediate and she just breaks out in tears. Her sister is dead and she's devastated. So you can see how time becomes a difficult concept for her as well. She also very heavily relies on her Blackberry that she uses to put down all of her appointments and things. She also uses the Blackberry for something else I'm going to quickly talk about now, and then I'm going to talk about again in a spoilery section at the ending of this video. Basically what she decides to do is that she wants to end her life. And she sort of has this idea as she gets the diagnosis, but then she stops and thinks, I don't want to end my life now. There's things that I still want to do. And as she notes in her mind the things that she wants to do, she wants to see her son fall in love, she wants to see her oldest daughter have babies, she wants to, I think with her youngest daughter, it's either see her go to college or see her in a play or something, and she has these sort of things that she still wants to do. And interestingly enough, none of these are connected to her career, so the thing that so much construed her identity beforehand. So that already goes to show you something. And she gives herself 5 questions that she needs to answer, and if she can no longer answer these questions, she leaves herself instructions on her laptop to go to if she cannot answer these questions. And on the laptop it then has instructions about how to kill herself. But eventually she loses her Blackberry, and for her that is a very, very crucial thing to happen, and she cries over this Blackberry. But this Blackberry represents so much more than just a thing where she puts appointments in. It represents the loss of her memory, it represents her ability to still rely on herself largely, and this is sort of lost with it. So I'm now going to talk about the ways that the disease changes Alice's interactions with her loved ones, the way that it changes what identity can mean, and the way that identity remains for Alice. So one sentence that describes the situation fairly early on is a conversation where she talks to her husband, and she hasn't gotten the diagnosis yet, and he throws at her the word that she's being needy, and the word needy smacked a vulnerable nerve. Needy equaled weak, dependent, pathological, it says here. So at this point it shows you the negative associations that are in line with things that happen when you have dementia, becoming dependent, becoming needy. It later goes on to show that that might not be a negative thing, but it shows how society views it and how Alice herself views it in the beginning as well. When she first goes to the doctor to find out what is wrong with her, the doctor also tells her that she herself might not be the most reliable source of what is happening to her. And he's obviously right. The way when we read the novel and see, while looking at things through Alice's perspective, realizing that she makes mistakes that she doesn't realize herself, we know that what the doctor says is right. But again, it shows how she needs to depend more on others, focusing on the relational aspect. And she's supposed to bring a family member into all the meetings henceforth, and she will bring John eventually. Especially with her relationship with John, her husband, there's a lot of room for contention and for frustration. There's this one very obvious symbolic thing that Lisa Genova put in there, where every time they're at the doctor's appointment or something, he spins his wedding band. That is one of those incidences where the novel hits you over the head with it a bit. Other than that, there's discussions. So the idea is that John will take a sabbatical and that they will have 1 year together still. And throughout the novel, John has a hard time dealing with the changes that Alice is going through, and he gets an offer to go to university in New York and work there. But that would mean not taking the sabbatical, but he wants to go to New York, and he very much fights with Alice about this, saying this is his one shot, and she says, no, this is my one shot. This is the 1 year where I'm still likely to recognize you, where we can still be together in a way that, is very meaningful and would mean so much to her. And he struggles so much with seeing her in this way that it is hard for him. So it also goes at this relational aspect and the difficulties that come with it. You can also see how he is fighting with the kids, saying he's going to take her to New York, and she doesn't know what she wants, and she's not going to realize anyway whether she's in New York or in Harvard. He can just tell her she's in Harvard, and she's going to believe him. And the kids are outraged at this, obviously. He tells them, she wouldn't want to be a burden on any of us. And I really like the way that his oldest daughter responds by saying she's not a burden, she's our mother. And so you see the different ways of going at it, and the way that relationships can become strained throughout this. And you also have a situation late in the novel where she talks to him and says she misses herself, and it's heartbreaking. But she still has happy moments, and she still enjoys being with him. These things are still important to her. There's also a scene in the first third of the book where she and John go out and eat ice cream. She already has received the diagnosis. And it says, despite the escalating erosion of her memory, her brain still served her well in countless ways. For example, at this very moment, she ate the ice cream without dripping any of it onto the cone or her hand by using a lick and turn technique that had become automatic to her as a child and was probably stored somewhere near the information for how to ride a bike and how to tie a shoe. And so she then goes on later, like I said, she has this decision to kill herself when the burden of her disease exceeded the pleasure of that ice cream, she wanted to die, it says. And then you have very late in the novel, you have a scene where again she's eating ice cream with her husband. And she does drip the ice cream on her hand. She seems to have forgotten this lick and turn technique, as she calls it. But she still is enjoying herself. She still is happy at that moment and in that situation. So the things that she expected at first to matter, do they still matter to her in the end? And the way that she defined happiness, or what it means to be for her, do these definitions change throughout the novel? Now, throughout the novel you see a move from Alice's mental capabilities as the focus. That was the main focus for her in her life, and the way that she valued herself, through other capabilities that remain even as she loses her mental ones. So early on, when she has one of her doctor appointments, you can see how she resents the situation. So she's basically being asked whether she understood a question that was posed to her, and then it says, although the context made the question legitimate, Alice resented it and glimpsed the subtext of conversations in her future. She'd always been addressed with great respect. If her mental prowess became increasingly replaced with mental illness, what was replaced that great respect? Pity, condescension, embarrassment? Even though these capabilities diminish, other things stay. So, for example, there is a point in the novel, about 2/3 in, where she interacts with her youngest daughter, and their relationship has been a bit strained because Alice desperately wants her to go to university, but her youngest daughter wants to pursue a career in acting. They actually get closer after the diagnosis of Alice and spend more time together. And there's a moment where she reads these plays that Lydia is acting in. When she's discussing these plays with her daughter, it says she saw Lydia and she loved her. So in that way, she opens up herself to new possibilities at the same time. It is, however, ironic that she here recognizes her daughter, and then 5 pages later she loses that memory. So you can see how the relationships also take a toll because of the disease, but you can also see how the relationships persevere. Towards the very end of the novel, there's a crucial scene where Lydia reads her lines to Alice and tells her, you know, I don't want you to focus on what these lines are about. I understand you can't remember that, but I want you to tell me afterwards what emotion you think I was trying to convey. In a bit of cheesiness, let's say, the emotion that is conveyed is love, but Alice gets it right. And that shows that, you know, while her mental capabilities may not be what they were, other things remain. And even if she doesn't recognize her daughter, they still can have a relationship. And relational identity doesn't only mean in the way that you recognize the relations that you have, but the dependency you have on others. And that doesn't go away. And it's just a stronger dependence in the case of dementia than for people who don't suffer from it. So in that way, we see that even though some aspects of Alice are lost throughout this book and throughout the development of her disease, other parts stay. And so Lisa Genova makes a strong case for identity being more than just your mental capabilities, which I think makes this book a very worthwhile read alone for that already. I am now going into spoilery territory, so you have been warned. If you haven't read it yet and you want to, please turn off now, and I will see you next time. I am not quite sure which book I will talk about next time. It's either going to be Small World by Martin Suter, or it's going to be Wrinkles by Paco Roca, a graphic novel. The Martin Suter one is a crime novel, so I would look at dementia as a suspense element in that one. Or if I look at Wrinkles, I would look at the way that it's dealt with in a graphic novel. So I'm going to spoiler territory now. So like I said, Alice makes plans to kill herself. She poses 5 questions to herself as she types into her Blackberry. And these 5 questions are: what month is it? Where do you live? Where's your office? When is Anna's birthday, so her oldest daughter? And how many children do you have? If you have trouble answering any of these, go to the file named Butterfly on your computer and follow the instructions there immediately. The instructions there are then to go take pills and fall asleep. The first time she answers these, the answers are very elaborate. Eventually these answers get vaguer. She may no longer be able to say the exact office, but just say that she works at Harvard. What she still gets right until the end is the number of children she has, even though she may not remember all of their names. So you can see how she starts failing at these questions. And then, as I said, she eventually loses her Blackberry. So she no longer has these questions prompted to herself. But in a conversation between the children and her husband, it is heavily implied that her husband has found the document on her computer about her plans to kill herself, and that he knows of this. When the ice cream eating scene, the second one that I mentioned earlier, he actually asks her some of the questions that were in that document. He asks her, do you know what month it is? And she doesn't know, she just knows it's spring. She also asked when Anna's birthday is, and she says maybe in May, and he says no. She asks where her office is, and she says it's at Harvard, and he says, well, which building? And she says, well, I don't know, but I don't really go there anymore, so, you know, why can't we focus on the things that actually matter? And he says, I'm trying. He held her hand. His was warmer than hers, and her hand felt so good in his hand. So she's happy, even though she can't answer these questions. And he then asks her, Alice, do you still want to be here? His eyebrows bent into a serious shape, and the creases next to his eyes deepened. This question was important to him. She smiled, pleased with herself for finally having a confident answer for him. Yes, I like sitting here with you, and I'm not done yet. So you can see that even though she can no longer answer these questions properly, she doesn't want to leave. She's still content. She's happy, but just in a different way than she expected to be. And I think this is a very poignant scene that shows what remains. Now, very shortly after this, in fact, pretty much 2 pages later on, she herself stumbles upon the file on her computer and reads it. And she has written this letter to herself asking her to do this and go get the pills and go fall asleep. The tragedy in this, she can not remember the instructions long enough to follow them. But while this is in a way tragic that she can not fulfill the wish of her earlier self, the question also remains whether that would really still be her wish right now. She's still happy, she still enjoys things, she enjoys holding her grandchildren, she feels content. The novel strongly shows how what we think is important and matters in life might not matter to us when we are at a different stage in our life, and especially when we're at a different stage with our mental capabilities, and to not underestimate that. And I think in that sense it sends a really strong message. If you haven't read it, I would highly encourage you to read Still Alice by Genova. And that is all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!